This is Gareth Southgate, and this is the Three Lions podcast.
Hello and welcome again to the Three Lions podcast. My name is Russell Osborne and this is an independent England football supporters podcast. Hope I find you well. I hope you enjoyed the most recent episode, the one where I spoke with John Driscoll about his most recent book, which is entitled Get It Kicked. Good book, that one. Once again, we're talking books in this episode. All the details on that coming your way very shortly. Stay tuned. Now, also that last episode, I mentioned about the England Supporters Travel Club membership. Well, since then, the announcement has been made. This has now been open to renew or join. This is as of Tuesday, the 24th of January. This membership period is running until Sunday the 14th of July 2024. I know, it seems a long way away at the moment, doesn't it? But that particular day is the last day of Euro 2024. It's the day of the final. Now, the cost for renewing for existing members is £55 for adults and £15 for juniors. Though I'm not quite sure, actually, what the cut-off for juniors is. Is it 16? 18? I'm not 100% sure. You'll need to double-check on that one. But worth noting that this is the same price as last time, which is pretty good, obviously, at this time, current state we're in. Any savings are good. But to renew at this price, you do have to do it by the 21st of July of this year, which I think is a given. If you're going to renew, then you're going to be doing it pretty soon, aren't you? Now, if you are applying for the first time, though, cost is £75 for adults and £30 for juniors, which, in my opinion, is still good value. £75 is what I think we had to pay pre-pandemic, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure it was around that price. But for more information, you will need to navigate the FA.com website. Search the England tab, then search England Supporters Travel Club. All the details will be listed there. And also, if that wasn't enough excitement, news on Italy away in March. Of sorts. Registration of interest to Travel Club members is to be made between the 26th of January to the 16th of February. And as yet, there is no news on any allocation. It would appear the Italians are making us wait. Once again, keep tabs on that England website for those details, or I'll mention it as soon as I know, as soon as I've found it out myself. And of course, coming with a new membership period is the subject of caps, loyalty points for following the team home and away. And this is only for the senior men, because there is no Lionesses equivalent travel club. The caps only apply to the senior men's games. You will find that the caps that you've accrued over the last membership period and those before will decrease going forward. I think I was on 44, I believe. Looking at it now, I think I'm down to about 22. So don't be alarmed if your caps do go down, but do make sure that all of your caps have been accounted for. Make sure of that. Anyway, so if you do renew, hope to see you on the road very soon in some far-flung places of Europe. Always good fun following England. Now, I wouldn't normally dedicate an episode to an England defeat, but on the very odd occasion, a scoreline sends shockwaves around the world and shakes a nation to its core, leaving them to find that reset button. Think Brazil in 1950, 2014 too, losing to both Uruguay and Germany respectively. North Korea beating Italy in 66, Cameroon beating Argentina in 1990. More recently, I guess Senegal beating France in 2002. I guess also ourselves in 1950, losing to the States. But there's another defeat we're going to look at here. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Three Lions podcast, Matt Clough, author of the book, The Match of the Century, England, Hungary, and the Game That Changed Football Forever. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Russell. Thanks very much for having me.
No, welcome along. Welcome along. You're a published author.
I am, yes. So this is my second book. My first book was a biography of Matt Clough, who I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be familiar with. You know, former England joint record goal scorer with Tom Finney, Bolton legend, and that came out in 2019. Was nominated for the Telegraph Sports Book Awards, and so this is my first. I suppose it is, in a way, it's kind of a biography of an event rather than a biography of a person. But yeah, it's a slightly different take on the same era, obviously, because the 1950s was also Matt Lofthouse's era, but he didn't play in this match crucially, as he liked to remind a lot of his teammates.
Well, I'm sure we'll get on to that. Maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you've written for The Guardian and the Independent, I think.
Sure. So I'm basically a sort of I guess you'd say a self-trained writer. I don't have a background in it. I'm not a journalist. I've always loved football, as I've alluded to. I'm a Bolton fan, unfortunately, and an England fan, of course. And yeah, I've basically for the past about 10 years have been freelancing in various different guises for various different places. Like say, I've done some work for The Guardian, done some work for The Athletic, and then I can't remember when I actually started the Lofty Odyssey, as in the Lofthouse Odyssey, I should say. But that I wanted to work on something that was a bit more permanent and a bit more, obviously, quite a lot more long form than a newspaper article, because as I'm sure you can appreciate, writing about football, particularly when I was doing it sort of not so much these days with places like The Athletic that are very much dedicated to long form journalism, but when I started really freelancing probably 7 or 8 years ago, a lot of places it was very much get as many clicks as you can, sort of traffic is king. And it generally meant that there was a focus on probably quantity over quality a little bit. And that's not to knock any writers or any publications out there, but it sort of drove me towards doing something with a bit more, like I said, a bit longer form, something that I could really spend, you know, in the case of both books, it was years of research and then probably about a year and a half of writing and another half a year to a year of editing after that before the books came out. So both pretty serious undertakings. I'm sure more experienced writers are able to put books out at a faster rate than that. But yeah, like I say, it's not my full-time job. I do it kind of around other commitments. So it's just something that I've developed as it's more of a hobby rather than a kind of profession. And hopefully that passion rather than doing it for necessarily kind of financial reasons shines through in both books. That's not for me to say.
So the book, obviously, you say, is the same time as Nat Lofthouse and that sort of era. And seeing you on screen, I'm assuming you're fairly similar age to me and wouldn't have been around at the time of the game. So at what point did you think, right, I'm going to write about this particular game?
So obviously, off the back of the first book, I'd done a lot of research around the era. And one thing I had kind of found as I was doing it, one aspect I was really interested in was not just trying to talk about the football and say, you know, whoever Arsenal or Preston were top of the league at this point, that kind of thing. I wanted to give a real sense of what Nat's life was like and what all footballers' lives were like at the time. So what it was like living in Britain in the sort of immediate post-war era. And as I was doing that, I found that 1953 was a sort of ridiculously eventful year. I say in the book, I think you can stake a claim for it being the most eventful non-wartime year of the 20th century, because so much happens. You've got the sort of, the structure of DNA is discovered, the polio vaccine is created, the first colour TV comes out, Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, Everest is summited, the Cold War ends, Stalin dies, the USSR detonate a hydrogen bomb. So my original very, very, very ambitious plan was I could do a book on 1953 as a whole, right. But quite quickly realised it, unless my publishers were willing to extend my word count by another sort of probably 1 to 2 million words, it wasn't going to happen. So I ended up coming back to football, as I always do, as we all do in everyday life. And obviously, the match of the century also happens in 1953. So my idea was to tell the story of this match, but also kind of illuminate to the reader what was happening around the time and what made the match so eventful and so important, because as well as all of the events I just mentioned, it's obviously the height of the Cold War. There's kids going to school and being told how to shelter from nuclear blasts and that kind of thing. You've got the West versus East aspect, the capitalism versus communism, democracy versus totalitarianism. Obviously, in the teams themselves, Hungary were really the upstarts and they're the students, whereas England were very much the old school, the teachers. They were still considered by many, including very much themselves, to be the kings of football. And here come Hungary as the kind of upstart. So I thought that there's so many angles to come at it. There's so much to unpack, and there have been some fantastic books recently come out particularly on Hungarian football, that obviously talk about the match in some detail, because it is, you can make a case for it being this sort of the high point of Hungarian football. But what I wanted to look at was the sort of everything that goes into the match from both sides, but also with a sort of renewed focus on the England side, because I don't think that had been covered in quite as much detail. I think a lot of the stuff around the match, and rightfully so, really, because it's Hungary's victory, and it very much focused on Hungary, whereas I wanted to kind of cover what was also going on with England at the time, and the impact it had on England, and why England kind of found that themselves in that position in the first place, getting humiliated at Wembley by this team that, basically the English sort of perception of before they arrived was, we've heard about these foreign teams coming over here, and we're always told they're the new big thing, and yet it's never transpired. So England obviously had their famous record of never having been beaten by continental opposition at home. Yeah. And this record that had been kind of little caveats have been added in because they'd lost to the Republic of Ireland in 1948. And so the record had been, before that, it had been, we'd never lost to a foreign side. And then it was obviously, we've never lost to a side from beyond the British Isles, or we've never technically lost at home, because that match was at Everton at Goodison Park. So, that was another aspect that I didn't feel had been covered, certainly not alongside the Hungarian side. So I wanted to kind of bring it all together and explain, hopefully, what was going on around the match, and just why it mattered so much, beyond obviously being an incredible result and an incredible scoreline that sort of stunned the footballing world.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the 25th of November, 1953. It was Wembley Stadium, England versus Hungary. It was also supposedly the first 100,000 capacity at Wembley, which I wasn't aware of at the time. And you've sort of mentioned a lot of it there, but the blurb on the back of the book, I think, encapsulates it all. It's West versus East, capitalism versus communism, the masters versus the students, the old guard versus the upstarts, the British Empire versus a satellite of the Soviet Union, tactical stagnation versus innovation. Stanley Matthews, Billy Wright and Alf Ramsey versus Fenrik Puskas, Sandor Kosic and Nandor Higeti. It all rested on the outcome of England versus Hungary. All that remained for them to do was play, which I think is a great sort of introduction to it all. I mean, the mighty Magyars, as Hungary were known as, they were Olympic champions at the time, weren't they?
They were, and they were also on this incredible unbeaten run. They'd not lost a match since 1950, and they some huge results in that time. A few kind of real cricket scores against a few of the sort of other Eastern European teams. They just absolutely steamrolled. A few big wins against Austria, who were there, obviously, very close neighbours, big rivals, kind of similar to sort of England and Scotland in terms of relationship. Very similar, but also would never want to actually admit that.
Yeah.
And then they'd also won. There was a sort of the name has been changed. I don't know how many times, but basically a competition, a round robin competition over the course of several years between Italy and then several of what we now call Eastern European teams, so Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary.
Yeah.
And they'd won that in 1952. They needed to beat Italy in Rome in their last match, and they went into Rome, won 3-0, and just and obviously at the time Italy were an extremely strong team, very, very known for their sort of tactical nous. So for this team to waltz in there and just dismantle them was unprecedented. So Hungary, they'd won the Olympics in 1952. It was actually at the Olympics that the match for England was arranged. So England's secretary, Stanley Rouse, saw them beat Sweden in the semi-final. I believe it was 5-1. So 1953 was the FA's 90th anniversary. So they'd kind of planned this. It was partly planned, part of it was just serendipity. They had basically a really packed schedule of matches for England in 1953 to celebrate this anniversary. Including a match against a rest of the world team, a kind of all-stars team. And, Stanley Rouse saw Hungary just absolutely, waltzing through the Olympic competition, which at the time was a much bigger deal than it is today. It was more full teams and that kind of thing. And, Rouse, in a moment of hubris that I imagine he came to regret quite significantly, saw Hungary winning all these matches and thought, it'd be a really great idea if we played them. He's an interesting character, Rouse. He did some. Unfortunately, he eventually became president of FIFA. Yeah. He was very supporting of the apartheid regime in South Africa, which obviously was not a good thing to be at all. But at the time, it seems surprising to say, given his later stance on South Africa. But he was very much a moderniser, and he lobbied for England to have a manager, which I know, again, by modern standards sounds hilarious that we didn't have a manager. And a lot of other teams did. But he was very much all about trying to at least drag England towards some semblance of modernity. But even he suffered from some of the kind of old hang-ups that, particularly Englishmen at the time had. You can tie it into sort of the British Empire, and at the time, the British Empire was in sort of state of collapse and disrepair, but it was very much sort of kind of a lot of Englishmen, a lot of British people still sort of clinging on to that idea by the fingernails. And I think he saw Hungary as this kind of potential huge scalp that could really cap off England's 1953, this 90th anniversary of the FA, by beating this team that everyone was going crazy about and sort of saying we're the new kings of football. And safe to say it didn't quite work out that smoothly. No.
Well, I mean, in the past, England had played Hungary on 5 occasions. They'd won 4 of them, lost 1, scored 26 goals in the process. So you could imagine that they were fairly confident going into the game, but they were very quickly, proved wrong in literally the opening minute of the game. Yeah, I think it's 45 seconds.
Wow. So you mentioned earlier that the sort of tactical stagnation versus innovation. So this was another sort of dichotomy at play in the match, which was basically England were using a system known as the WM, which had been devised by Herbert Chapman, Arsenal manager. By 1953, it had been sort of pretty common across England, and by extension, because most countries kind of aped the English style, it had been basically in play for about 20 years.
I think as well, just for those that maybe don't understand the WM setup, if you were to imagine it's a W on top and an M beneath it, I think, isn't it? And
yes.
where the points join up would be the player's position. There's 10 points, I believe. So if you were to visualize a W, capital W on top of a capital M, on top of a football pitch, you'd sort of visualize the positions of people. But it's one for people to go and take a look at to understand more.
Yeah, sorry, that's my fault for, I watch all of the, watching the Premier League these days, and I do wonder why Guardiola bothers with his formations. You just go back, keep it simple with the WM. You've got one centre back, two sort of full backs, kind of basically a back three. Then you've got two effective, what they used to call half backs, but are effectively sort of defensive midfielders. And then the W, as you've rightly put it there, it's kind of a flatter W, if that makes sense. You've effectively got two kind of attacking midfielders, sort of two tens, and then you've got two wingers which are effectively level with the centre forward.
Yeah.
So this style had been in vogue in England. The attitude was very much, we invented football and we invented this formation. Therefore, that's all that's said and done.
Yeah.
And what Hungary had done was basically started to think outside the box. And the phrase I'm sure a lot of listeners will be familiar with is this deep lying centre forward. So effectively what Hungary did was they realised that a lot of teams, and in particular England, were so rigid in the WM and stuck to it so dogmatically that all they needed to do was make the slightest tweak to it, and the opposition would effectively fall apart, because suddenly the centre half wouldn't have the centre forward where he was expecting to mark him effectively. So all that Hungary did was told their centre forward Nandor Hajdaguti to drop deep, basically, rather than just stand next to the centre half for 90 minutes, try and win headers and, be the focal point of the attack. He could drop deep. And basically, as soon as they did that, it completely derailed their opponents, and particularly England. And it's, again, by modern standards, it sounds laughably simplistic, but really, I think that the case to make for the match of the century is that what Hungary did with tactics, it wasn't even thinking outside the box. It was basically thinking the unthinkable, because tactics in those days it wasn't even a consideration when you talked about how you're going to win a match. If you read match reports from the sort of 1930s and 1940s, or even the early 1950s, there's never a mention of, this team, they overloaded the right-hand side or something like that, or that defensive midfielder really, did a number on their number 10. It just wasn't a consideration at all. So for Hungary to come in and basically wield tactics as a weapon, it was almost like a sort of a philosophical sort of. It's very difficult to put into words. I hope I had done somewhere in the book, but it was just something that England had never even countenanced, and it basically meant that Hungary had the match won before they'd even stepped on the pitch. It was like, if you consider tactics to be like a chess match, it was a little bit like England walked up to their board and realised, they were already in check, and they only had a couple of pawns to defend the king, and Hungary just held all the cards, had all the pieces, and there was nothing they could do. There was some criticism of England at half time, and there was a lot of finger pointing. Stanley Matthews blamed England's manager Walter Winterbottom for not, devising a plan over the first 45 minutes and then relaying it to the team at half time of how to basically stymie the Hungarians and how to counteract them. But you're basically asking all of the English players and Walter Winterbottom, as good a coach as he was, to basically undo everything they'd ever learned about football in 45 minutes and come up with something completely new. It was, and needless to say, they weren't able to counteract them. It didn't go very well for England from there on in.
England were 4-2 down at half time. So there was the goal in the first minute. Jackie Sewell scored to equalise after 13 minutes. Hidegkuti scored another one. Puskas got 2 in space of 3-4 minutes, and then Stan Mortensen just before half time made it 4-2. But by then, like as you say, the damage had already been done, not just in that game, but for years to come after, really, for the English game, English national team.
Yeah, I think what you'd expect to have seen from a defeat like this, it really shattered all of the myths of English football. You mentioned at the very start, England had obviously lost to the USA in Brazil in the 1950 World Cup. And again, I'm sure a lot of your listeners will remember the build up to the recent World Cup match with USA, because that was mentioned quite frequently. And that should have been a moment when the FA turned around and said, what's just happened here? But there was it was a very insular organisation, the FA. So, as I mentioned, the fact that England had a manager at this point was a minor miracle and was a relatively new innovation. However, Walter Winterbottom, the manager, didn't actually get to pick the team. That was done by a selection committee, which was constructed entirely of chairmen and members of the FA. And I think fundamentally, those men in the FA realised that in order to truly reform the team, it would require it would basically be the turkeys voting for Christmas. It would be them saying, we're clearly out of our depth here. We clearly don't deserve these positions anymore. We clearly can't rely on the fact that England are England, that we're going to have players who are 9 times out of 10 are better than their opposite number when we play international matches, and we can just rely on that to win. So really, unfortunately, 1953 was yet another result which should have triggered this huge upheaval in English football, but didn't. And actually, the next year, there was a return match before the 1954 World Cup in Budapest, which, I mean, that was it. What is really marked about that match is that the tone in the press before the match, because very much before the match of the century in 1953, there was a very much a triumphalist sense in the press. I think that there were some dissenting voices, but there was still a lot of, Hungary are good, but we'll find a way. We always do. But before the Budapest match, there was very much this is going to be an absolute massacre, and hopefully it won't be too demoralising. As I think you were about to say, it didn't work out as the FA had hoped there, because it ended 7-1 to Hungary. And that was the final match before the 1954 World Cup. So exactly the sort of preparation you need, really. Puts last year's Nation League's defeat into a bit of perspective, really. Yeah,
and to date, that remains England's biggest defeat, and hopefully a result that we won't ever see again. But just to go back to the match, just to round it off, that in the second half, Bozic, is that how you pronounce it? Scored. Yeah,
Joseph Bozic.
Yeah. Hidegkuti got another one, and then Alf Ramsey, of all people, scored. And I know that he took quite a lot of influence, maybe the right word, maybe not, but from that game, going into his managerial career, having sort of looked into that in the past as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this marked the end of Ramsey's international career. This was the last time he ever played for England. But he was a really interesting character in that he was never a particularly talented footballer. But what he did have was an unbelievable reading of the game. And being a defender in those days, if you couldn't physically kind of, flatten whoever you were up against, or, send Stanley Matthews 5 rows into the stands every time he tried to take the ball past you, you needed to have a really, really good sense of anticipation and reading the match. And you're absolutely right. Ramsey was, of all of the England brains involved and all of the impact that the game had or didn't have, as is the case of the FA, Ramsey was the one who really took something away, and obviously went on to have this managerial career where he was really the trailblazer in England for thinking outside the box tactically. Because although the FA were very slow to react, the Match of the Century did at least impress upon England players, England fans, England press that tactics were now a thing. You had to consider that they were another part of the puzzle, and often were the most important part of the puzzle. So yeah, Ramsey took a huge influence in this. When he became England manager, one of his conditions, the things that he insisted on in order to become manager, was that he had full control of the team, because he took over from Winterbottom, and Winterbottom never ceded control from the selection committee. And obviously, as we all know, Ramsey took control of the team. He picked his players. He, introduced formations which, when they didn't get results, he was absolutely hounded in the press, and they were saying, "Why have you changed it? Why have you? We've got the wonderful WM, which has only ever failed us on several occasions. But why would you change this? Why do you think you know best?" And as 1966 proved, it turns out he did know best.
Yeah. There was one other thing, and I've forgotten the guy's name. Wasn't there a guy who had left England, gone to Hungary? Was he a coach?
Yeah, Jimmy Hogan.
Jimmy Hogan. He's quite important to the story as well, isn't he? Or got a certain part to play?
He is. So Jimmy Hogan, I believe Jonathan Wilson, who's an excellent writer, and I'm not going to put myself in the same league as him. He's very much the godfather of football tactical writing, and has also written several fantastic books on football history. He has credited Jimmy Hogan as being potentially the most influential coach in football history. He was a player in the early 1900s. 1900s, and had a sort of a decent career. But then when he was playing for Bolton, they had a tour abroad. I think it was in Holland, and the English team, Bolton, were comfortable winners on all of the tour games, and he felt that the players they were up against had a lot of raw ability, but that they didn't have the application, they didn't have the means and the tactical understanding and the training methods to apply those abilities and that kind of raw potential and make some be able to compete with the likes of England and the other British teams. Yeah. He then, when he retired, went on this incredible tour of Europe, effectively spreading the gospel of football everywhere he went. And so he, like I say, he spent some time in the Netherlands. He was very noted for his time in Austria, where he worked with the national team and was basically, fated as this almost the godfather of Austrian football. And obviously Austria in the 1930s, alongside Italy, were one of the sort of real superpowers in Europe. And he had a similar impact in Hungary. He managed various teams. There were a couple of other British coaches as well. There was a Scottish coach called Andrew Robertson, who was involved with both club teams and the national side at various points, as was Hogan. And they really laid the groundwork and the foundation for Hungary's success, sort of 30 or 40 years later. And they did this by, again, that Hungary knew of football. They were very much, in love with the game. They were passionate about it. But the idea of training and tactics and the kind of the things that in the early, decades of international football made British teams, particularly England, such a force, were this. It was the preparation. It was, their enthusiasm can only take you so far. And Hogan very much instilled this, understanding in every country he went, including in Hungary. And what was interesting about Hogan was that when he despite this incredible career of travelling around and achieving so much, he whenever he returned to England and tried to get a job in the Football League system, the door was always slammed in his face because he didn't know the right people, and he was too willing to he wasn't a yes man by any stretch of the imagination. He was too willing to say, you're doing this wrong. I know the way that this should be done. And a lot of chairmen at the time were just thinking, well, is this going to get me instant results? No. Is this potentially going to cost me money by this guy demanding that we sign a bunch of new players? Yes. I'm not interested. And actually, in the 1950s, he ended up as a youth team coach for Aston Villa. And that it was under that capacity that he went to Wembley to watch the match of the century. But then when the Hungarians got wind that the famous Jimmy Hogan was there, obviously out in the stands, the English fans were stood next to him and had no idea who he was. But as soon as the Hungarians got wind that he was there, they got him down to the dressing room and were telling him that all of these things about how he was. I think the quote from Gustav Seves, the Hungarian coach, was that when they write the story of Hungarian football, it will be Jimmy Hogan's name that is written in gold in lights, because he was an absolute legend. It was it would be like if England had won abroad in the 90s. And they then heard that Alf Ramsey was there watching them, that kind of thing. But potentially even more so because, Hogan, it's impossible to understate just what an impact he had on the country's football. And like I said, the fact that the players and all the coaches knew who he was, even though he'd probably not been in Hungary for at least 20 years by that point, it was that sort of shows you what an impact he had.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the follow-up game that was played in Budapest, where England lost 7-1. But the Hungarian team of the time and Hungarian football began to diminish shortly afterwards, really, didn't it?
Yeah, and it's a really sad story because obviously they go into the 1954 World Cup as huge favourites. Yeah. They absolutely swat everyone aside. I believe they beat West Germany. I think it's 8-3 in the group stages. Then they beat Brazil. Then they beat Uruguay in one of the most the Brazil match is marred because it just descends into violence. The later matches are slightly better, but then they end up playing West Germany again in the final, and obviously having won by such a huge margin in the group stages, they feel very confident. But as it transpires, things don't work out so well. They go 2-0 up in space of about 9 minutes. But Germany are playing a pretty much a completely different team. So when they first played Hungary in the group, they said, well, at the time it was thought that the German coach was effectively changing his team to protect his best players from being humiliated. He knew they were going to lose, right, and so didn't want to expose them to this huge loss, basically. But that's kind of been disputed, and obviously they went on to win the final, and it's now thought, was it a kind of rope-a-dope sort of situation where he thought, we'll play our second team, we'll lose, we'll still get through the group, and then if we get far enough, we'll play Hungary again, and then I'll see what we're really made of. And there's plenty of other conjecture around the final. So Hungary had an equaliser, which would a goal which would have made it 3-3. Ruled out for offside in pretty much the last kick of the game, and it's impossible to tell from the footage we have whether it is offside. But I believe I can't remember which way around it is, but there's certainly a Welsh official and an English official involved in the final.
Oh, right.
And so Hungary makes some, I think Puskás says, it's strange how we keep ending up with these English officials or British officials, and basically saying if that was revenge for the match of the century there. There's also some interesting suggestions that the German players were actually all under the influence of performance-enhancing drugs and were all kind of being injected with various substances at half-time, and we're all sort of, rather than celebrating after the final whistle, we're all kind of collapsed and throwing up because of whatever had been put into their systems. But yeah, that's a it's still a huge, I guess you say, albatross around Hungarian football's neck. The fact that they had this team, they'd been unbeaten for 4 years and they didn't win the World Cup when having been 2-0 up in the final and just cruising. And then, unfortunately, politics gets in the way. So in 1956, Hungary undergoes a revolution. There's an uprising against the Soviet Union. Very, very briefly, it looks like the uprising has been a success. There's a new prime minister installed and all that. And then the Soviet Union basically strike back. They decide it's too much of a humiliation to lose Hungary in this manner, in such a well publicised way on the global stage. So they strike back. They take control of Hungary, and a lot of the players from the Golden Team, the Magical Magyars, they basically see it as now or never. If they're ever going to escape Hungary and the Soviet Union, they have to go now. They know that the likelihood of them enjoying the sort of freedoms and privileges they've had is probably going to disappear, because the fact that there's been this uprising means that the totalitarian control in Hungary is only going to get worse. So a lot of the players flee, a lot of them defect, including Puskás and Szybor and a couple of others from the Golden Team. I think the Hungarian under-21 team at the time is away doing in a sort of a youth competition, and basically the entire team defects. They all say, we're not going back to Hungary. There's no chance. So that Hungary, they do go on to have some good results in the 1960 World Cups, but obviously they fade badly away. And it's an interesting one, because on the one hand, you think, well, think about teams like France, and obviously Germany were a rising force at that point, but France hadn't really realised their potential. Portugal hadn't really realised their potential. Spain were another one who were still kind of in their, they were a long way behind England in their sort of development at that stage, but would obviously had huge populations and, a real passion for football. So I think it's an oversimplification to say that because of the revolution or the failed revolution, Hungarian football, that was what killed it. And it's possible that other nations would have caught them up anyway. But then you do look at countries such as Uruguay, who have consistently, they had a golden generation way back in the 30s and have basically never really lost that ability to consistently punch above their weight. And you do wonder if Hungary could have been the sort of the European answer to a Uruguay, to a smaller nation that consistently finds a way. And unfortunately, we'll never know. So it's a sad end to a tale, but they will always have the match of the century, and unfortunately, so will England.
Indeed, yeah. No, and I appreciate it's 70 years ago now, isn't it? Now we're in 2023.
Yeah.
I mean, were you able to speak to anyone or anyone secondhand to get views from the time?
So I when I was interviewing for Lofty, I interviewed quite a few players, including a couple of Bolton players who went on to play for England in the 50s. They were playing at the time, but they weren't involved in the match of the century. And obviously, I spoke to a lot of people who knew Matt, who again he missed out on the match of the century. I say missed out in inverted commas there, because I think he was quite happy to have done so in the end. But through a combination of injury and potentially because the FA had seen the Matthews final being played just a few months before, and there's a sense that with their selection for the match of the century, they were trying to harness some of that Blackpool magic. So I think there's 4 Blackpool players in the England team, including Stan Mortensen playing at centre forward, which he didn't normally play for England, which is normally where Lofthouse played. So through those interviews, I was able to get a sense of what it was like playing, and certainly the attitudes and expectations for playing for England at those times. So I spoke to Tommy Banks and Doug Holden, who both played for England. And they both mentioned the match of the century as this kind of absolutely incredible moment that no one saw coming. I think there was a sense that, okay, maybe one day a continental team or a foreign team will come here, they'll sneak a 1-0, and we'll say, okay, this unbeaten record's gone. But whatever. But the fact that Hungary just came in and from start to finish just absolutely dominated England, and at times felt like they were playing a different sport. They described that as a shattering moment. And unfortunately for both of those players, they came into the fold in the late 50s after the Munich disaster, when English football was not only was it trying to find its identity again after so long of assuming it was the best, and then suddenly being, very clearly told it wasn't. And then, going into the 1958 World Cup, it felt like England had this real makings of a fantastic team, regardless of tactics. It was really what the FA couldn't have asked for anything more, because in the wake of the match of the century, and as we said, the FA were very much willfully ignorant of the fact that tactics were now, they had to be a consideration. But England, during the 56 and 57, did really develop a team that was almost good enough that tactics didn't matter. And that was, you've got Tommy Taylor as centre forward, Duncan Edwards as the sort of powerhouse in midfield, and obviously they both lose their lives in the Munich disaster, and that is a real shattering blow to English football. So the combination of that sort of loss of status, and then the loss of this new kind of core of young players who are unbelievably talented, made it very, very difficult for the players I spoke to really come in and know what to do. And it took the arrival of Alf Ramsey and new ideas and new fresh impetus to really revive England.
Yeah, it's all this stuff that, because it was so long ago, it's so important that it's documented and is down in book form. What's the reaction been to the book?
Yeah, it's been really positive. It's been I've had some really nice comments. I think one thing I found as I was doing the book, obviously I kind of finished writing it really about this time last year, sort of January 2022. And one thing I did have in mind was, obviously it was England grappling with Britain grappling with the loss of empire at the time, which really, it put a lot of strain and pressure on the football team to really go out there. And obviously kind of India had gained independence. A lot of the other territories and colonies of the English Empire were moving away, the British Empire, I should say. And the football team basically bore a lot of the brunt of that, because it was like, well, you've got to go out there and prove Britain is still Britain. Yeah. And obviously there's parallels with Brexit, not hopefully to get too political on the podcast, but there's a sense that I think Britain is now trying to figure out, where do we stand in the world, what's our role. And I do think that does kind of bleed into the profile and the support of the England team, and obviously the other home nations as well, where it's like, they're suddenly they're really, really having to, there's a nation's kind of expectation, but also pride, and also it's a lot of additional pressure. And then obviously other things have cropped up. So, I very naively believed that sort of the days of the Soviet Union, as I was researching it, were long in the past, and it was all a sort of something we'd never really see the likes of again. And then obviously we had the Ukraine invasion, and that's brought those kind of the West versus East and the those sort of Cold War tensions come simmering back. And as I mentioned before, 1953 was obviously the year that Queen Elizabeth II was coronated, and then she passed away just in the wake of the book coming out. So there was, like I say, it's a long time ago, and it feels like when you're researching it, like Britain, we had rationing and stuff like that, and it's just a completely different. It feels it's 70 years ago, but it might be 700 years ago. It feels like completely alien to what we've got today. But then these things keep coming on, and it keeps reminding you that actually, maybe not so much has changed. Maybe it's still the same debates being had, and I'm not saying I'm glad that England didn't get absolutely torn apart by France in the World Cup, but I'm sure if they had, we'd be having the same conversations again. It would be, who should be the manager? Do we need a foreign manager? Do we need, how do we update our tactics? How do we get ahead of everyone rather than, just kind of copying what's gone before and what's worked in the past and that kind of thing? So it's like you say, it's a long time ago, but it's also fascinating how these things kind of circle back and repeat and come again.
How interesting. So have you got any plans for a third book?
I mean, I don't think the Nations League defeat to Hungary at Molineux last year is quite as evocative yet. Maybe in 70 years that would be one. But no, at the moment I'm just taking some time off from writing and obviously promoting the book. And having a think about what I'll do next. You know, when I finished the first book, I said I don't want to do another football book, and then I did another football book. And my reaction after finishing this one was sort of, I don't want to do another football book. Certainly one about the 1950s, but you know, maybe in a couple of years I'll be back on here talking about the 1958 World Cup or something like that from England perspective, or something along those lines. So no plans at the moment, but I'm sure I'll start to get the urge to do something in the next few months.
Yeah, well, you'd be more than welcome to come back on. The book is called Match of the Century, England, Hungary and the Game That Changed Football Forever. It's published through the History Press. And I'm guessing it's available for all usual good bookstores and everywhere else you get your books from, I guess.
I believe so. It's certainly on Amazon and all of the bookstores online. And then I think it's in most Waterstones up and down the country. So, yeah, it should, hopefully wherever you look, it will be.
Yeah. Well, no, I wish you all the very best with it. And if people want to get in touch with you, you open to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the easiest way is on Twitter, where I am at Matt J. Clough. And yeah, if you read the book, loved it, hated it, I'm always happy to hear from people who've read it. So by all means, get in touch.
Great stuff. Well, Matt, thank you very much for taking the time to chat to us. Been interesting. There's so much to learn about this era of English football and this game. I'm sure in another 70 years, people will still be talking about this particular game.
Yeah, I hope so. Like I say, maybe not some of the Nations League matches won't stand the same test of time, but I think this one will go on and continue to be studied and used as an example of where things can go horribly wrong for England. Hopefully, it will be a reminder as England win our sort of fifth World Cup in a row. People will revive the memory of the match of the century to be, you weren't always that good. But maybe that's slightly wishful thinking.
We shall see. Well, we won't be here to find it out, I guess. Thanks to Matt there for his time. As we mentioned, the book, The Match of the Century, is available through all good bookstores, book providers, wherever you get your books from. And of course, you can follow him on Twitter at Matt J. Clough. Now, recently, I've been looking to add to my collection of England programmes, and when I was talking to Matt about doing this episode, I thought I'd look into getting a copy of this match programme. I saw one recently on eBay with a match ticket. It sold for £103. Perhaps I'll hang fire on this one and try and fill some of the more recent gaps that I have. Anyway, many thanks as always for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And with no games at the moment, I hope you can appreciate that content, it can be a little sparse. Filling an episode with England players who have moved during this January transfer window has proved to be a little tough. But I do hope to be speaking with some people of interest in the next few weeks for some future episodes. So stay subscribed and you won't miss it. I'm off to renew my travel club membership as I'm currently out of contract. Could go a little bit Bosman. Now there's a reference that all of a sudden seems incredibly dated. But until next time, take care of yourselves. Cheers.